And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for episode 12 of this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports, with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, including our ever-expanding Facebook page, just past 10,000 followers there. It's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you do your podcasting on Apple and you have a second, please leave a rating and review. A number of people have done this already, and not only do I appreciate the feedback, but the more ratings and reviews we get, the more likely it is that others will discover the show as well. Last time, we talked about what I believe is the best American film of 1961, The Hustler, but today, on this first installment of a series that will stretch into the coming year, I thought before we head into our coverage of 1962 that I'd take a look back at 61 and cover aspects of that year that I've neglected thus far. So I'll be covering a wide range of topics in this series, shedding more light on a year that really, with the possible exception of 1968, was as dramatic as any of the 1960s. So today, we'll cover some of the top cultural trends of 1961. I'll also talk about an outstanding performer who released her debut album that year, but we begin where we left off last time, at the movies. So without further ado, 1961 Part 1, right now. As I said, The Hustler for me was the best American film of 1961, had the most to say. But what about the best foreign film that year? Well, 61 was not as strong in that regard as 1960. 60 was truly a cornucopia of landmark foreign films, including La Dolce Vita, Federico Fellini's last great film in my opinion, Francois Truffaut's woefully underappreciated Shoot the Piano Player, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless. He did better work later in the decade, but Breathless was certainly very influential with those jump cuts and improvisatory style. And finally, Antonioni's La Ventura, about the disappearance of an unhappy young woman on a boating trip. At least that's what it seems to be about, but as the film progresses, her self-involved lover and best friend, after searching for her a bit, commence an affair and seem to forget she ever existed. All those 1960 films from Italy and France are highly recommended. But my choice for Best Foreign Film of 1961 is not Italian or French, but Swedish. Ingmar Bergman's Through a Glass Darkly, which was a departure in several ways for the writer-director, and ultimately won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Film of 1961. Bergman's second Oscar in a row. He'd won it the previous year for Virgin Spring, a rape and revenge film that I don't really recommend. And he didn't either, actually. He later called it a wretched imitation of Kurosawa. But Through a Glass Darkly is the first film of an unnamed trilogy by Bergman. Let's call it the Spiritual Trilogy, released over the course of an exhausting 2.5 years. Through a Glass was followed by Winter Light and the Silence, released at the beginning and end of 1963 respectively. And Bergman, son of a strict Lutheran minister who later became chaplain to the King of Sweden, Bergman thought it was finally time to come to grips with his own religious baggage after having spent most of his life rebelling against that outlook, both personally and in his work. Many of his films from the 1950s, The Seventh Seal for example, seem to indicate an atheistic or at least agnostic viewpoint. But he struggled with it. And this trilogy, especially the second film, Winter Light, the most overtly religious of the three. The protagonist there is a pastor, superbly played, as always, by Gunnar Björnstrand. But this trilogy was Bergman's attempt to put some of these issues to bed for himself. And the way he described the progression of these three films, which he called his Opus 1, was that Through a Glass Darkly represents religious certainty achieved, Winter Light depicts religious certainty unmasked, and The Silence, the most challenging of the three, Bergman called a negative impression, the silence of God. As I said, Through a Glass Darkly was a departure for Bergman in several ways. First of all, he had employed fairly large casts for most of his previous films. Here, he reduces the cast to just 4 characters, so kind of like a composer shifting from orchestral writing to chamber music. And this is the first of an increasingly intense series of chamber dramas produced by Bergman in the 60s and 70s. So that's an important shift and one that gave him an opportunity to go deeper into his characters. Another very welcome change was the hiring of cinematographer Sven Nykvist for this film. Nykvist dramatically altered and, from my perspective, massively improved the look of Bergman's films going forward. Gunnar Fischer, his previous photographer, was certainly a master of conventional studio lighting. He also favored expressionistic effects with greatly heightened contrast. But Nykvist was a master, well, he was a master of everything, but an absolute genius with outdoor photography, not Fischer's forte. Many of the exteriors in The Seventh Seal, for example, to me are quite disappointing. But Nykvist's preference was for naturalism and simplicity. He loved real light, especially twilight and dawn. And somehow he was able to capture more nuance in black and white photography than others could with a full color palette. His compositions are marvelous as well, master image after master image. So there's a much more realistic look to this film than the ones shot by Fischer, but it's a kind of heightened, intensified realism. Another departure, Through a Glass Darkly was the first film shot by Bergman on the island of Faro, spelled Faro with an umlaut over the O. It's off the northern tip of Sweden in the Baltic Sea. It's an island with incredible rock formations. Initially, he wanted to shoot this film in the Northern Isles of Scotland, the Orkney Islands, but his production company wanted something closer to home. But Bergman later said that even before he set foot on the island, as he first approached it on the ferry, he knew that it would be perfect for this film and others he had in mind as well, and shortly after that, he realized it was where he wanted to live. And not only did he shoot many more films there, including a 1970 documentary about the island called Fora Document, he did live there most of the time and died there actually in 2007. So the central character of this film, around whom everything revolves, so sort of like the lead violin in the string quartet, is Corinne, played by Harriet Anderson. As the film begins, she's just been released from a mental hospital, but she continues to suffer from intermittent psychosis, an apparently incurable condition. So her exact disorder is never named, but it certainly resembles schizophrenia. Corinne's father, played by the aforementioned Gunnar Björnstrand, is an author who is secretly using his daughter's illness as the foundation for his new book, about which he feels somewhat guilty, not only over this exploitation of a family illness, but to a large extent he's been an absentee father. Corinne's husband is played by the great Max von Sydow, who would burst onto the international scene in The Seventh Seal, where he played the medieval knight. Here, he plays a doctor who is tormented by his inability to help his sick wife and is also unsure whether to inform her that her illness is incurable. Corinne's younger brother, played by Lars Pasgard, is troubled by several things: adolescent sexual frustration, his sister's frightening descent into madness, and finally the emotional gulf separating him from his remote father. So the primary theological aspect of this film is that Corinne experiences delusions throughout about an impending meeting with God. And she ultimately does meet him, but through a terrifying hallucination, where God appears to her as a monstrous spider, which then proceeds to ravage her. Now, we don't see the hallucination, but we certainly see her reaction to it, which is really something to behold. There's also a brief theological conversation at the end of the film between Corinne's brother, Minas, and his father, which forms the basis for Bergman's capsule description of this film as religious certainty achieved. Another common Bergman theme broached in this film is the artist as exploiter, the intellectual parasite, personified by the author-father, possibly a stand-in for Bergman himself, who, like many a director, had a tendency to become personally involved with his leading ladies, which leads to another Bergman theme that would be explored in greater depth in future films: sexuality, specifically twisted or deviant sexuality. In this case, an unseen act of incest between brother and sister that takes place inside a wrecked ship. All these themes would be more thoroughly and more brilliantly covered by Bergman in later films: Persona of 1966, The Passion of Anna in 1969, and Scenes from a Marriage in 1973. That was actually a TV series, at least initially. He cut it down to movie length later, which he said was the hardest thing he ever had to do. But those are the three masterworks of his later period, in my opinion, toward which this 1961 film kind of points. Now, it almost goes without saying in a Bergman film that the acting is superb. Not only did Bergman have a keen eye for talent, he worked with most of his actors year-round. When he wasn't shooting films, he was directing plays in Stockholm and elsewhere. So he was very familiar with his actors. His technicians as well, set designers, costume designers, these people would migrate with him from theater to film and back again, which is obviously a huge advantage. To me, the acting standouts here are Harriet Andersson as Corinne, it's a virtuoso performance, and Björnstrand as the father, who's just remarkable. In one early scene, a superficially cheerful outdoor dinner, Björnstrand gives his 2 children and son-in-law hastily selected gifts from his latest trip abroad, and just through facial expressions manages to convey, as he watches these gifts being opened, first the anxiety and then the certainty that he has somehow failed these people. And after politely excusing himself, ostensibly to get some tobacco for his pipe, we follow him into the house, where he suddenly turns his back on us, faces a window, and breaks into loud, racking sobs. It's the first indication that we're in for something quite a bit different in this film. As for the music, the opening credits, actually the entire film, incorporates the slow movement, the Saraband, from Cello Suite No. 2 in D minor by Bach. Bergman was an ardent lover of classical music, Bach in particular. He once said that if he hadn't been a director, he would have liked to have been a conductor. And like Stanley Kubrick, who was a great admirer of his, Bergman had excellent instincts with his choices of classical music. One of the most incredible sequences in Persona is an extended close-up of an unraveling Liv Ullmann, which incorporates the slow movement of another Bach piece, the E major violin concerto. But the solo cello works perfectly in this film, very much in keeping with the austere, stripped-down concept that I mentioned. One minor imperfection for me would be a scene that follows that outdoor dinner. It's a play within a play, or play within a film, that Minas has written for his father and performs with his sister. That seems to me a bit forced and a little precious. And generally speaking, Bergman's later films of the decade would be more formally daring. But on the whole, Through a Glass Darkly is artfully directed and beautifully written, with those famous Bergman epigrams that cut to the quick about life, death, relationships, everything. And by the way, Bergman's spiritual trilogy, despite the Oscar for this first installment, was not initially well received by audiences who had gotten used to a certain thing from Bergman and seemed to resent the shift in tone and the new austerity. So box office numbers, which had been very strong for Bergman in the 50s, dropped off a bit. At least until The Silence, the third film, which has several explicit for the time sex scenes that would not have been permitted in Hollywood in 1963 and remain a bit, not shocking, but startling. But the controversy surrounding that, which led to The Silence being cut in many countries, including here, turned it into a box office sensation. And in retrospect, it was kind of a watershed. You know, despite the ultra-serious and often surreal content of that film, very much including the sex scenes, which are integrated into the larger philosophical vision, The Silence is what gave the Swedish film industry its reputation for pushing sexual boundaries. And it set the stage for a massive incursion by filmmakers worldwide into previously forbidden areas as the 60s moved ahead, both for better and for worse, I think. Okay, next up is a list, my top 5 cultural trends of 1961. So, number 1 is political. 61 marked an early warning shot of an impending phenomenon that struck fear into the hearts of Democrats all across the land, and that was the Deep South and Southwest starting to trend Republican. There was a special election held in May of 61 to fill the Senate seat vacated by Vice President Johnson the previous year. And John Tower, who was raised a Democrat but switched affiliation in the early 50s and then served as one of Eisenhower's Texas campaign managers in 1956, Tower won that 61 election, becoming the first Republican U.S. senator from the Lone Star State since Reconstruction. Now, as for the Deep South, yes, those Democratic Jim Crow congressmen and governors had supported Kennedy and not Nixon in 1960, reluctantly in some cases, but the string of civil rights conflicts in the early 60s that placed the federal government in opposition to states like Alabama and Mississippi, when the governors of those states kind of forced Kennedy's hand, these incidents severely strained that relationship, to the point where Senator Strom Thurmond, a Democratic senator from South Carolina and a big big proponent of Jim Crow, was already talking up Republican Barry Goldwater in public in 1961. Thurman would later switch parties prior to the 64 presidential election and endorse Goldwater, who won 5 former Confederate states in that election, which, other than Arizona, his home state, were the only states he won, which actually can give a kind of a distorted impression of Goldwater's views on civil rights. I mean, he wasn't just a supporter of the NAACP, he was a member, and he had actively supported the desegregation of Phoenix. He'd also been personally responsible for integrating the Senate cafeteria. His very first year there in 1953, Goldwater insisted that his black assistant, Catherine Maxwell, be served along with every other Senate employee. He voted for the 1957 and 1960 Civil Rights Acts. He would vote for the 24th Amendment in 1962 that prohibited the poll tax, but Goldwater did vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a vote that caused him considerable anguish. There were 2 clauses related to employment in that 64 bill that he felt overreached and were unconstitutional. And even though that bill did pass, he later said that that vote was one of his greatest regrets. But this tectonic shift where you had the South, especially the Deep South and Southwest, drifting Republican, which has pretty much held to form ever since, with some exceptions, was certainly starting in 1961, and the Democrats knew it, which is why you saw so much foot-dragging on civil rights. Although I must say, after spending the last year or two examining this period, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was more aggressive in that regard than I'd previously given him credit for, certainly more so than the previous administration. Okay, cultural trend number 2 is the twist. The dance craze, which 60 years ago today was at its absolute peak here in America. Everyone, from kids to celebrities, was doing it, and it would quickly migrate to Europe, worldwide actually. And even though it looks kind of quaint and innocuous today, it was actually somewhat controversial at the time. It was considered sexually provocative. Kind of a paradox, considering that the dancers performing the twist do not touch, but I guess the pelvic movements could be construed as sexual. To me, it just looks like 2 people trying to stamp out a cigarette butt. But Chubby Checker released the song The Twist in 1960, which was actually a cover. It had originally been released in 1958 as a B-side single by Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. Ballard had seen some teenagers doing this odd-looking dance at a club in Tampa, and he wrote a song about it. But Dick Clark, who was a powerhouse in the music business for decades with American Bandstand, his 5 times weekly music and dance show, he saw the potential in Ballard's song, but he thought the Midnighters' image was a bit too raunchy. So Dick Clark urged the Parkway Record Company to re-record it with a more wholesome performer. And Chubby Checker's version, which I prefer actually, I think he has a better voice than Ballard. It really cuts through the mix. But this became the first song in the rock and roll era ever to hit number 1 twice in non-consecutive years, once in 1960 and again in 62. The Peppermint Lounge, which was a discotheque on West 45th Street here in New York that was open from 1958 to 65, was kind of the launch pad and world headquarters of the twist. Joey D and the Starlighters were the house band there in 1961. And after gossip columnist Earl Wilson mentioned in a column that year that Zsa Zsa Gabor had been seen there dancing the twist, it became a celebrity scene practically overnight, with everyone from Audrey Hepburn to Frank Sinatra, to Shirley MacLaine, to Truman Capote, even the elusive Greta Garbo showed up one night to twist the night away. But then, of course, once adults started doing it, it became uncool. And teenagers moved on to the pony, the Watusi, the monkey. But none of these subsequent dances, the funky chicken, would ever hit the craze level status of the twist, or filter into the general culture in quite the same way. By 1962, the twist had been covered not only in respectable papers like the New York Times, but also referenced on The Dick Van Dyke Show, on Leave It to Beaver, even the Flintstones, where it was called The Twitch. It was also mentioned in the second issue of The Amazing Spider-Man comic book, Spider-Man making his grand debut in August of 1962. Moving on to our third cultural trend of 1961, the ever-deepening worldwide anxiety about nuclear war and radiation, driven mostly by the Berlin crisis that played out really all year, but greatly intensified that summer. leading to the border closure in August and the beginning of construction of the Berlin Wall. And then that fall, a series of atmospheric tests by the Soviets of just massive hydrogen bombs, each bigger than the last. There were also regular civil defense drills, endless talk of nuclear shelters by President Kennedy and others, which, when all is said and done, may have served to only intensify the anxiety. Anyone with an IQ over room temperature must have known that those shelters offered no protection from the impact of a hydrogen bomb for people in targeted areas. Those shelters were just tombs prepared in advance. I mean, forget the radioactive byproducts. If the Russians dropped one of those 50 megaton monsters on Manhattan, this city's a parking lot. I mean, just the heat given off by that explosion would cause fatal burns like 30 or 40 miles away. Now, as the Kennedy administration pointed out, after the Soviets tested their 58 megaton bomb on October 30th, which was and remains the most powerful nuclear weapon ever tested, a bomb that size was not intended to be practical. I mean, two 20 megaton bombs dropped a few miles apart would cause considerably more widespread destruction. But that bomb was intended to terrify, and it did. And clearly, a lot of people in 1961 were expressing anxieties about this issue to their doctors and psychiatrists, because the American Medical Association introduced a new medical term in one of its publications, Today's Health, in September of that year, nucleomytophobia, or the fear of atomic radiation. And then in December, that same organization, the AMA, released a statement, this I found somewhat amusing, urging mankind to, quote, stop worrying about radioactive fallout and concentrate on getting ready for Christmas. There really isn't very much that us average folks can do about it anyway. Whether you're in favor of fallout shelters or not, we can't just retreat to a shelter this winter. The man of the house has to go to work, the lady has to go shopping, and the kids have to go to school. If there is radioactive fallout in the air, we'll get some of it, and there's nothing we can do about it, unquote. Can you imagine that kind of statement being released today? But where's the lie? I mean, it's fatalistic, but kind of true. But you see this fear of nuclear war and radiation play out in the popular culture as well. A Twilight Zone episode called The Shelter, which aired in September of that year, where a suburban dinner party is interrupted by a radio bulletin about an impending nuclear attack. And then, after the unprepared neighbors scramble and panic, they end up turning on the one family that's installed a bomb shelter. And then in Winter Light, the second film in that trilogy by Bergman, a central subplot in that film revolves around a fisherman, played by Max von Sydow, who is deeply distraught over the prospect of China getting a nuclear bomb, which was pretty good foresight by Bergman. China actually did get the bomb in October of '64, about a year after that film was released. But this fisherman seeks out the counsel of the main character, the pastor, who struggles and ultimately fails to come up with an answer, which leads to the fisherman committing suicide. So no shortage of anxiety in 1961 about nuclear annihilation, and that fear would be further heightened the following year with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would also, by the way, inspire one of the more creative films of the early 60s, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, where the prospect of nuclear annihilation is presented as a surreal and often quite hilarious black comedy. Okay, the fourth cultural trend of 1961 continues a trend that started in the late 1950s, and that is the steady rise in popularity of the National Football League, which would culminate in its overtaking of Major League Baseball in the 70s as the de facto national pastime. Now, there were several reasons for this rise, but if you had to identify a single tipping point, it would have to be what is now known as the greatest game ever played. The nationally televised NFL championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants played at Yankee Stadium on December 28, 1958. It was a hard-fought, dramatic, up-and-down contest with a little bit of everything, which the Colts finally won in sudden death overtime on Alan Amici's touchdown run on a handoff from Hall of Famer Johnny Unitas. 14 future Hall of Famers either played or coached in that game, including the legendary Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry, both on the Giants coaching staff, the former serving as offensive coordinator, the latter defensive coordinator. But that game was viewed on NBC by an estimated 45 million people, which in 1958 represented 26% of the nation's population. and it would have been substantially higher if the NFL had not blacked out the game in the New York City area. Well, blackouts of home games, that was common practice back then to boost local attendance. Even in the 70s, when I was a kid, I remember Knicks home games were not on TV here, which was super annoying. So New Yorkers not able to attend this game in '58 had to leave the state to see it on TV. But the sensation caused by this one game touched off a series of positive aftershocks for pro football. First of all, it directly inspired the formation of the American Football League 2 years later by executives who saw not just the incredible ratings, but how many cities did not have local teams. And after functioning as a kind of unruly, very litigious rival to the NFL, the AFL filed a big antitrust suit in 1963. The merger of these two leagues was finally announced in 1966, and that would become official prior to the 1970 season. And NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle was also a big factor in this rise in popularity, a brilliant marketer and very tough negotiator, who in 1962 persuaded NFL owners to aggregate their TV rights into a single league-wide contract, which gave the NFL huge negotiating power with networks and advertisers. And then, of course, the first Super Bowl in 1967 between the NFL's Green Bay Packers and the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs was not such a great game. The Packers dominated, but it was a massive media event. And by the way, it was not called the Super Bowl that year or the next. It was called the AFL-NFL World Championship Game. Kind of a mouthful. The name Super Bowl was not used until the 1969 contest between the Jets and the Colts. And the origin of that name can be traced to a single source, Lamar Hunt, owner of the Chiefs. He started using it after he saw his kids playing with a new toy that you may remember if you're my generation or older, the Super Ball. And the media picked up on Lamar Hunt's Super Bowl phrase, and by '69, that name and the use of Roman numerals became official. But by 1972, Gallup polling showed that pro football had finally become America's #1 sport in popularity, and it really hasn't ever looked back. College football, which has been around much longer, since 1869 compared to 1920 for the NFL, is obviously a huge draw as well, and I actually prefer it. I think the games are better. And our last cultural trend, 1961 was the first year in which sales of RCA color TV sets exceeded their sales of black and white sets. This had not happened since color sets first went on sale back in 1954, after years of failed attempts and technical setbacks dating back to the early 40s. Now, one major factor that boosted RCA's color TV sales in the early 60s was that RCA owned NBC. And NBC, therefore, was producing and heavily promoting a number of color shows, including Bonanza, which debuted in 1959 and for 2 or 3 years was the only TV Western shot in color. And after a shaky start, Bonanza really caught fire in 1961 after a critical move from Saturday evening to Sunday, where it faced far less formidable opposition. And the results were immediate. The 61-62 season was the first in which Bonanza overtook Gunsmoke in the ratings. That season, by the way, was the absolute pinnacle of the TV Western's popularity. The #1 show overall was Wagon Train, #2 was Bonanza, and #3 was Gunsmoke. Bonanza would eventually hit #1 in 1964, and it really was the most consistent, strong-performing hit TV series of the 1960s. Now, one factor that had delayed the rise of color TV, in addition to the relative scarcity of color programming, was money. First of all, it was a costly process to convert existing TV stations to color transmissions, so that was slow going. On top of which, the price of color sets for years had been prohibitive to the vast majority of American families. In 1954, the Westinghouse color model sold for $1,300. That's equivalent to roughly $13,000 today. But RCA came up with various innovations that reduced the cost of production and therefore the prices of their color sets. They also started offering much smaller sets in the 60s that sold like hotcakes. But it was slow. I mean, in 1961, ABC did not offer any regular color programming. CBS, very little. But NBC's outstanding ratings for its color programming, especially Bonanza, made these other two networks sit up and take notice. And by the 66-67 broadcast season, all three networks were airing full-color primetime schedules. So something you'll notice when you look at shows that either debuted in the early 60s, like The Andy Griffith Show, or shows like Gunsmoke that had started in the 50s but continued on through the 60s, all these shows switched from black and white to color in the middle of their runs. Or, in the case of one of my favorites from that era, The Fugitive, at the end of its run, just the final season of that show was shot in color. And finally today, moving from TV to pop music, about which I've said almost nothing on this podcast, an album that wins my personal prize in 2 categories, Best Album by a Female Artist and Best Debut of 1961. And this album, when it was released by Columbia Records in February of that year, was simply called Aretha. But since Aretha Franklin later released another album with that title in 1980, it is now known and listed on Spotify as Aretha in Person with the Ray Bryant Combo. And her super abundant gifts are already on full display on this record, released when she was only 18. And this year, by the way, 1961, marks the first known use of the term soul music, after the terms soul brother and soul food had surfaced in the 50s. And soul became a hugely popular genre in the 60s that spawned another immensely popular genre, Motown. Soul and Motown would dominate American and British charts by the mid-60s. I mean, the Supremes rivaled the Beatles in worldwide popularity in the 60s, and are still America's most successful vocal group ever, with 12 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Now, as for the origins of soul, or recent origins, you can obviously trace any major genre back endlessly, but I guess Ray Charles would be the founding father of modern soul. Certainly James Brown and Sam Cooke were apostles as well, and Aretha, the properly anointed queen of soul. I mean, no one really came close. Now, her bands later in the decade would get better and substantially funkier. For example, check out that tune, The House That Jack Built, from 1968, with that famous Muscle Shoals rhythm section and just killer backing vocals. And of course, production quality on her records would also improve as engineers gradually learned how to harness the stereo beast and also to fatten up the bass and drums. But this debut album was one that Columbia Records actually had a hard time classifying, in that it was truly a showcase covering a wide range of jazz and pop standards, including a Gershwin tune. But the power of Aretha's delivery, that swagger, the authenticity developed over many years of performing on her minister father's gospel caravan tours, it's all there, virtually fully formed. But it took a few years for Aretha to achieve superstar status. She would ultimately have much greater success after she moved from Columbia to Atlantic in 1966, after which she released a series of incredible hit singles from 67 to 72 that really stand the test of time. But check it out, Aretha in Person with the Ray Bryant Combo. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care, and I'll see you soon.